Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact and donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go, leave a rating and review. It's easy. It only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app you're using right now and hit 5 stars. Thank you so much. Previous guests on the show have included JT Thomas, AJ Swoboda, and Pam Arland. You could go back, listen to those episodes and more. But today's guest is Josh White. Josh White is a speaker, recording artist, and writer and founding pastor of Door of Hope, a family of churches in the urban core of Portland, Oregon. Josh lives with his wife Darcy, son Henry, daughter Hattie. Portland is the city where he and his wife Darcy met 23 years ago while Josh was playing a show with his then Seattle glam rock band, Man Ray. Little did they know that their lives within a few years would be turned upside down and revolutionized by the gospel of Jesus. He just released his first book, Stumbling Toward Eternity, for Penguin imprint, Multnomah Press. Josh and I have a great conversation around the foolishness of the cross, around our need to be confronted with the end of ourselves so that we can be dependent on Christ. We talk about how confession can drive our communities, being a witness to Jesus in the world, and radical grace and vulnerability. It's a really good episode. Enjoy my conversation with Josh White. Josh, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I loved your book, Stumbling Toward Eternity. It was, I think, we're at a similar age. I grew up in the Northwest, so I could get, references of like the crocodile and other things that made it a little bit more enjoyable for me. Seeing Michael W. Smith at Jesus Northwest, those things that came up in some of your reflections. So I was like, yeah, I was there too. So it was really enjoyable. But what I loved is the radical grace, forgiveness, vulnerability of the cross, of this act that Jesus did as the Savior of the world, as he's there giving his life up. And that actually changes the way that, one, we relate to God, but two, the way that we relate to each other. How has the cross transformed your own life and your story and the way that you interact in the world?
Yeah, I think when I came to faith later in life, so like in 1999, I was living in Seattle. I'd moved to Seattle right when I got out of high school and started pursuing music. And so, that pursuit, ending in the loss of a record deal a few months after I got married, and then just the kind of anxiety and existential dread that created that led me to open up a Bible my mom gave me when I was 21. But reading through the Gospels, I think the first conviction that struck me was that there was something about Jesus. There's power in the name of Christ, and I share a story in the book about asking a group of musicians at the Crocodile, like, what I was reading the Bible, and I wasn't even a Christian yet. And I asked them what they thought of Jesus, and that just the horror at the question. Even I was like, this response goes beyond what would be acceptable or normal. And what I didn't share in the book is that just before I asked that question, a girl sitting next to me was telling us that we knew she was a part of this whole new age kind of druid movement, and that she was talking about summer solstice and how her and all of her druid friends got naked up on Capitol Hill and were running around in the park up by the cemetery where Bruce Lee is buried, celebrating summer solstice nude, and nobody said anything. They were like, "That's awesome." And then I'm like, "Hey, I'm reading a Bible. What do you guys think about Jesus?" And everyone's like, they seriously acted like I stripped naked in front of them.
Yeah.
and so I think that there was something compelling about, like, what is it about Jesus that is so offensive? It's more than just like cultural, biases or something. There was something deeper than that. And then when I came to faith, I realized that I think it all comes down to the centrality of the cross, and the offensiveness and the foolishness of the cross, as Paul put it. And I was immediately enamored with the Pauline letters, and specifically his focus on the cross in the beginning of 1 Corinthians. There's just like this strange, to think of the intellectual prowess that man had, his ability to assimilate Greek thought and Jewish thought, and bring that as a tool to serve the gospel. And yet he says, I've determined to know nothing but Jesus Christ and crucified. And then even his focus in on, the Jews seek after signs and the Greeks seek after knowledge, but we preach Christ crucified. I became obsessed with those 4 words. We preach Christ crucified. And it was in that point where I realized, like, man, the cross is, if the gospel is the center of the Christian message, the cross is the center of the gospel. And that if we remove the cross, we actually drain Christianity of its blood. Because we can't even talk about resurrection insinuates first death.
Yep.
And what I love about the cross is it brings the gospel literally down to earth. It's like the beauty of that kind of radical grace theme that you mentioned about the book comes out of what my friend David Zoll calls a low anthropology. It's like human beings' absolute impotence and inability to reach God in their own strength. That was my whole conversion point, was that verse in Matthew chapter 5. It says, therefore be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And I remember being so frustrated, I wanted to throw my Bible out the window. And it was in that moment, it was like the Holy Spirit, just like, that's the point, is you can't be. It's like Jesus is laying out an impossible possibility. Yeah. He's calling us to put faith in his perfection, not in ours. And God's come down and met me in my brokenness. And the cross also is one of those elements. There's so many aspects to atonement that I find so fascinating. Different denominations and in groups under the umbrella of Orthodox Christianity have long debated over the mechanics of atonement, and even emphasized different elements of it. But I think that there's a book called The Mosaic of Atonement. That's a really great book. I think it is Josh McNally, I think is the guy that wrote it. That focus shows how, like, different denominations, the Orthodox, the Catholic, the Protestant, but then even within Protestant, have a different emphasis. Christus Victor, Jesus's triumph over the domains of darkness. Recapitulation, Jesus is the second Adam, and the firstborn over new creation. And then substitution, the idea of Jesus as the scapegoat, essentially the sin bearer. And it's like, depending on your denominational leanings, like there's Reformed thinkers tend to focus almost primarily on penal substitution. Yeah. Eastern Orthodox tends to focus on Christus Victor or recapitulation, but it's like they're all there. And then that's the beauty and the mystery of the gospel. It's like, I need the triumph, I need the substitution, and I definitely need Jesus to be the man that I can't be.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think, even with different denominations, a lot of it comes out of our own cultural biases, and things that out of who we are and where we were raised and how we were brought up. These are the things that we emphasize within our culture, even though it's all there. And that's what I don't like about all these different denominations. But what I do like about it is that we actually need each other now. Like, hey, we've emphasized this maybe too much, and we've lost some different aspects of the cross, of atonement, of Jesus, and maybe we missed his missionary aspect of who Jesus is, or we've missed whatever it is with Jesus. So how do we see this? I'll just give you a little bit of background. For me, my wife and I were in the Middle East. We worked a lot with Muslims. They love Jesus as prophet, but the cross is very offensive to them. How in the world can this man die a death that we should have died, and then resurrected? So they believe that, it wasn't Jesus on the cross, or he was switched out at the very last second, because he couldn't die this death. It's very offensive to them. Why are we okay with all the other aspects of Jesus? And I'm sure in post-Christian Portland, where you are, you could talk about Jesus and his works and his ministry and who he is all day long, but the cross is so offensive. Why do we get to that point of like, this is the offensive piece?
Yeah, I think that the foolishness of the cross it's an absolute affront, especially in our modern kind of psychological age, in which the individual experience and we're the products of a massive cultural shift that goes back a few hundred years, but really took root and gained momentum in the 20th century, that now is kind of, I think, is run its course to its final, upside down logic. And that is the idea that, sadly, I think the church has fallen into many of its trappings, and that is the central importance of the individual experience, like kind of an existential vision of existence, where the only thing that's ultimately real is my own experience and my own feelings. And so, relativism was a first nail, the distrust of truth. Now we have like a whole anti-historical, anti-Western intellectual movement of and a re-embracing of kind of Marxist revolutionary ideas around like the oppressed need to bring down the oppressor. And the problem is that because we don't trust history any longer, we forget that every time the oppressed brings down an oppressor, they just create something more oppressive.
Yeah.
And it kind of plays into our whole victim culture. The cross is offensive because it actually becomes, as Rene Girard points out, one of my favorite philosophers, who really developed the idea of mimetic rivalry, that everything in human history in a fallen state is that we're driven by the desire for what others have. And that desire is actually what it means to be made in the image of God, but sin has caused us to focus our desire on people rather than we desire to be with God and one with God. We now just desire to have what isn't ours, and to possess it at all costs, which creates the scapegoat mechanism and the need for violence. It always moves to violence. And I think that there is kind of a violent response to the cross, because the cross tells the individual that they're not the most important thing in the universe. And not only that the great motto of you can do anything, you can be anything, the demand of the cross is actually an acceptance of your actual inability. That's why I actually love the 12-step program. Yeah. Because the 12-step program, its effectiveness is actually, and I think it's actually probably a more beautiful and pure picture model of what the church should function like, which is it's the people who have come to the end of themselves and recognize that they cannot do this without the help of others, and ultimately without the help of God, meaning its higher power or whatever. But the idea is like, it's a radical confessional community that recognizes their impotence without, so they continue to call themselves alcoholics, even if in that actually in the context of community is their triumph over alcoholism. I think that's the Christians. Our sainthood is actually, the triumph of sainthood is actually found in our continual recognition of our sinfulness and our desperate need for dependence upon the sinless Jesus. The cross is the leveler. It eradicates our ability to be the victim, and because it forces us to remember that Jesus died for the victim and the victimizer. that he's both the judge and the judged in our place. And so I think that its offensiveness comes down to is that you have to acknowledge that you can't save yourself. And everything in human history is built upon kind of what I call ladder theology in the book, but it's, I agree with Luther, everything can be split into law and gospel. And ladder theology is the heroic journey. I'm like, I got to climb my way up. I got to prove my worth. I need to find my enoughness in X, A, B, C, D, when you name it.
Yeah.
But there's never ultimate satisfaction in any of those things.
Yeah.
Which you and I, I'm assuming you're close to my age. Like I turn 50 next month. Like that's what they call a midlife crisis, is realizing that the heroic ascent doesn't lead us where we thought it was going to lead.
Yeah.
And now I got to figure out what we're going to do for the second half of our lives.
Yeah.
That we've discovered the ceiling of limitations.
It's helpful. I mean, I don't know if it would have been helpful, 25 years ago to be able to figure out the ceiling of your limitations. I'm sure it would have been, but in your youthful zeal to be able to climb the ladder and to continue to move forward, it's really difficult to get to that midlife crisis to say, okay, I'm actually getting to the end of myself. And this is where God is beginning. And this is where I have to surrender all to him.
That's the absolute, like what I talk about, our absolute disdain when a celebrity takes his own life. And I said, like when Kurt Cobain killed himself, it wasn't that everyone was in love with Kurt Cobain that created the distress in this whole generation of young people. He became like a principle in scripture. He became the one for the many, a voice of discontent, of frustration, of despair and fear. And he becomes this voice, but he reaches the pinnacle of human achievement. And he just throws it away in this crazy moment where he just all of a sudden takes his life. And our freak out is that it's like he got to where none of us will get. We can't even get to base camp. And this guy got all the way to the top. And it's like he looks down from the top of the mountain and says, sorry, guys, there's nothing up here. And so our upset is not that we cared about him as much as we'd like to think. Our upset is that he just revealed to us that what we're chasing after isn't the thing. And that's where I think that the cross is like the great leveler. It actually brings a realistic vision of life, and at the same time, an unbelievable, almost, it is a transcendent vision of hope. Because God's like, you can't get to me, but I can come to you. And why would he come to us? And that's the mystery of his love, his grace, a love without contingency. That the first word is, Father, forgive them, because it's God's heart to forgive. And that is just a mysterious thing.
It is. And this radical grace to move into this, it actually drives us into being part of community. And one of the things now, as we are the church and we're the body of Christ and we're continuing to be in this community to give grace to others. You talked a little bit, you mentioned Girard's mimetic theory. And so if we have some mimetic desires, so if we're desiring something that is not Jesus, the ones around us will start to desire that as well, right? We're going to start to mimic the desires of the people around us. So how within community can we start to desire Christ, to know that it's the end of me, that I'm not trying to climb this ladder so that everybody else around me desires that ladder climb, but I'm the one that desires Christ, or our community desires Christ above all, so that we all can start to desire Christ instead of get caught up in all of our infighting and things just to jostle for power.
Yeah, well, I think that it goes back to that passage in 1 Corinthians 1. The Jews seek after signs, the Greeks seek after knowledge. I see often there's this strange battle between those two realities. One is pride and experience, The other is pride in knowledge. And I see that in my more reformed circle of friends. The pursuit of, there's a deep passion for being theologically right. Being sound. It's almost like many of my reformed friends they almost view it as like their responsibility to be the police of good theology. Like they hold the corner on it or something. But my really charismatic friends, like they're like, whatever, I don't care about that. I want to know how it actually change, how do I experience God? How does it change my life? I want to see the power of the gospel. And so the experience overrides the theology, not that it's without theology, and not that those that chase theology are devoid of experience. I just think that the enemy's great work, I would say that Satan's greatest work is not outside of the church in that pagan universe that seems to be under his rule. The greatest work is his ability to take God's servants and turn them into his own tools. And I think that he does that by getting our focus off of the cross and onto things that actually matter. Experience matters. Knowledge matters. We want to have understanding. We want to have intimacy. But we want to be people that function in power, not in fear. We want to be a people that have wisdom, not foolishness. However, the cross is the place that it's the anchor in the center that produces the humility necessary to have the proper intimate experience and the proper pursuit of knowledge. But we lose sight of that. And so that's where I see those battles, it's like I've seen the spiritual pride that can so quickly take over, not just like a church leader, but over a church community. And all of a sudden, once again, it becomes an us against them mentality. That's why I got so disheartened during 2020. And it's like all of a sudden, instead of the church talking about the gospel, the church is talking about social justice issues or politics. And and really the two are married. And it's not that we shouldn't be good citizens, and it's not that we shouldn't care about the impacts of modernity on the vulnerable or the broken in our society, but it became a vitriolic and even a radicalized atmosphere. Instead of being radical for Jesus, it became, I'm radical for this particular cultural point of view. And all of a sudden the gospel is like left, the cross is not even a conversation piece. It's like and now we've got a whole new like land filled with scapegoats. and so I think that one of the things that the church post COVID has got to learn is that I think that the world is tired. I think the distaste for Christendom has something to do with the fact that Jesus said, if the world hated me, it'll hate you as well. But I actually push back and say, well, that statement's true, but what we're often hated for is not for our love for Jesus or for one another. We're hated for the hypocrisy that the world experiences when they see a bunch of Christians trying to present an ideal that they themselves can't keep. And that's where I think. So I think that we need a communal. The cross pushes us into a position of a communal, confessional kind of spirit. And it's like, we talk about vulnerability, but usually when Christians talk about vulnerability, they just mean they read a Brene Brown book. And as lovely as her writing on vulnerability is, it's like I don't know what it is about Christians and their inability to be really honest, especially pastors. I think that's why we keep having pastors fall. It's like,
because we have to hide who we really are, what's going on, and if something's wrong, we think everybody's gonna leave us.
I remember hearing an old pastor of part of the movement that I was a part of that was talking about how not to even buy Martinelli's sparkling cider because it might give someone the assumption that you're buying alcohol. But that same pastor was, notorious for putting other pastors who had affairs back in the pulpit. And I'm like, man, talk about selective sanctification. It's like we find the things that, make us feel all right in the world. Like, I don't swear and I don't drink, but I might be duplicitous and have a totally secret life.
Yeah. Well, then
I think that we have to live out that brokenness openly. The victory is actually that we don't have to live in a position of defeat because of the sin that's still at play in our bodies.
Yeah. And that's really good. And so my question was, like, how do we start to do that? How do we live out our brokenness together? And, as you said, the 12-step program, I've seen a lot of people coming into the doors of the church that are working the 12-step program. And to me, it brings life to the congregation. It brings life to the community of God that's there, because there is a more of a radical vulnerability saying, hey, this is who I am, and I'm at the end of myself, and I need God. And shouldn't we all be at this space? How do we live into this open brokenness that helps people heal and move forward towards a Jesus that is good and hopeful and great, and doesn't just wallow in our brokenness?
Yeah, I make a comment in the book about the power, the discipline of confession. There's a renewed interest right now in spiritual formation and the works of guys like Dallas Willard or Richard Foster. And, I have things that have benefited greatly from those guys, and I'm all for spiritual disciplines, but often the contemplative practices, which I'm a little more leery of, like solitude and silence. I'm kind of with Luther. I think solitude is the devil's playground. And I think that too many pastors spend way too much time alone. I know that I have, and times where it just gets too much. And then we justify it by, misapplying a passage like Acts chapter 6. We're taking something and making it prescriptive. Like, it doesn't even say that the Holy Spirit led those guys to say that all we should be doing is praying and studying the word. And we're like, this is the establishment of deacons. It doesn't say that anywhere in the text. And those guys did not function like deacons. They functioned like apostles.
Yeah.
While the apostles were away praying and seeking God. So I'm leery of anything that pushes us into isolation. I think the great cure for the church today is that we need to get away from, and it is very difficult because there's a million voices vying for affection, but we have to break free from the hyper individualism of our culture. And we need to come back to communal language. The church fathers were very specific. They never, there's no language in our theology books that says one God, three individuals. It says one God, three persons. And individual is our uniqueness defined apart from others. Personhood is our uniqueness defined in the context of relationship with others. That's a biblical vision of uniqueness. I like the uniqueness of who I am as Josh White is found in the context of my relationship with the community. Our gifts are discovered in the context of the community. Our victory over sin is found in the context of community. And it's a confessional place where I say that when we confess our sin, it actually becomes the place where we meet God most powerfully, and not just to God, but to one another, because it puts us in a position of humility and gentleness in how we care for one another. And it's risky and it's messy. And someone might even use your confession against you. And that's the risk that it's worth. And it's actually far more dangerous, to hide, because the whole essence, the first consequence of sin is hiding. It's like, that's the outcome, they hid. And so like we should be reflecting the opposite. What does it look like to come into the light? And the more we come into the light, the more we'll begin to actually have victory over the sin that we had once kept hidden. And so that's where I think that what we give a lot of space at Door of Hope for confession, and calling people. And I try to model it as a preacher. Some people are uncomfortable with that. And it's not like you don't want to glorify sin, obviously, or take lightly the consequence of sin. But we also, at the same time, need to hold tenaciously to the fact that Jesus has dealt with sin, that sin, in the words of, I think it was Chrysostom that said that sin died with Jesus on the cross. that all sin, past, present, and future, has been forgiven, but even forgiven sin still has the ability to wreak havoc in our lives. And that's why we need to confess it. So people are like, why do I confess it if it's already forgiven? Because it may be forgiven, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have consequences. Confessing it breaks free the tyranny of Satan telling us that God will never forgive you for that. And so that's where I think that the triumph of Christian life, it's like that's where the line that becomes blurred between saint and sinner.
Yeah. So then how do we structure the community of believers in a way where confession can be a part of what we do, and it's not individual confession, but it's a confession of the personhood that's connected to the community?
Yeah, I think that it has to start with leadership. And so, I do a lot of work for the Luis Palau Association, and I do what's called their renew, their front end festivals before they go in and do a festival. I love them because they have such a commitment to working with the local church. They won't do it unless the local church has buy-in. But I'll go and speak to all the pastors on the front end, and I really have a heart for kind of explaining this particular passion of mine, because I worked in churches where the pastors were so private, and I worked for several pastors that had moral failings, and so it was like that. And to me, it was just like this kind of connecting of the dots. Like there's a pattern here, and the pattern is just like is that we actually have created ladders. Where the whole gospel is supposed to free people from the tyranny of the ladders that the world is presenting, to satisfy, our longing for wholeness. And we get them in the church and we tell them Jesus is accepted or just as they are. But then we get them in and then we give them a new ladder to climb that's actually more exhausting and more difficult and not nearly as fun. Because we forget that the goal of the Christian life isn't arriving, it's knowing. And so I think that we have to, when you're actually in a real relationship with someone, your best relationships are the ones that you're honest about your brokenness. And so, I model that. I try to model that from the pulpit. We give space to it in our worship experience. So when we have our worship and communion at the end, we encourage people every week to come forward. That our elders are always up front, prayer team, people come. We share our brokenness with one another, and in doing that, we find freedom, and we even encourage that in our community groups. And that's the cause. Like what makes Door of Hope has always been a very strong evangelistic community, is our evangelism it flows out of that idea that the whole church together preaches the cross.
Yeah.
And we do that by they'll know you're my disciples by your love for one another, your care for one another, and that, hey, on your worst stinking day, Jesus is crazy about you. That's the thing I tell the church every week. It's like, you're not a bigger failure than God already knows you are.
Yeah.
That's why the gospel is such good news.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah. So what does that look like? If you're an evangelistic church, as you're going in and preaching, they're saying, here's the cross of Jesus, especially in this, the post-Christian area of Portland. I know that, I've had people on my staff that have gone to Portland and say, it's really easy to talk about Jesus in Portland. It's a little more difficult to talk about the church, but it's really easy to talk about Jesus. What does that look like then, I think, for a lot of people? And I think, Portland, I think, is a little bit ahead of the time than a lot of the rest of the United States is in the West. So what does it look like? How do we get to this place where we could be open about our own brokenness and about our need for Jesus and the cross?
Yeah, well, I think it's true. Portland is probably the first pure, post-Christian city in the United States. And because it's always been a bit of the Wild West. I mean, Portland, it's funny. It's one of the oldest cities in the Northwest. So there's churches everywhere that were built, and Portland had its own, the Welsh revival was a global revival, and it hit Portland as well. That there was a time when every shop for 6 months in downtown was closing down for prayer.
Wow.
Around 1908. But that revival, like all revivals, they come and go. And I think that Portland's always been a very spiritual. So unlike a city like New York, New York still has an incredible foundation in both Catholicism and Judaism. Like there's, you go to Times Square, the two statues in the Times Square is one of a famous Jewish leader and the other of a famous Catholic priest, and I think that Portland is kind of the opposite of that. Its background is very spiritual, but the coexist sticker, is dominant. We're the largest lesbian population in the world.
Wow.
So the transgender conversation hit here before it hit anywhere else. Even more so that I go to London every year, and it's like not even close to what you see in Portland. And Portland's beyond the transitioning from guy to girl or girl to guy. It's like there's a whole community here of people that are, claim to be elves and wear prosthetic elf ears. It's like that's the nature of a world that says you are whatever you think you are. And your interior identity is actually the most important thing. So this is where it makes the gospel challenging. People are very open to the gospel, but this is why the cross is foolishness, though, is because the cross demands identity be rethought. It's like people come to faith, and I'm like, you're not a gay Christian, because your identity isn't your sexual preference. Your identity is Jesus, who wants to embody your brokenness wherever you are. But I think that at the same time, because people don't have a background in the gospel, there is a willingness to talk about it, and far more than people assume. There isn't the hostility that you would think. There's lots of hostility in the city, and right now we who live in the city and love our city are mainly just hostile toward our terrible, terrible city government, who has allowed Portland to just be. We once were Portlandia. Now we're beyond Thunderdome, and it's like it's wow. The issue. Dora Pope is really trying to work toward that too. It's like, what does it look like to be in a city where we've become a mecca for homelessness, because it's a place where you can do meth and fentanyl and not be prosecuted. And we'll give you a free tent and feed you 4 meals a day. So it's like, it's forcing us to even rethink, like, classic Christian vision is that we should feed the poor,
right,
or feed the hungry. Well, what if feeding them actually is helping them kill themselves with fentanyl? Like, what do you do then? So we're having to rethink, and I think that the city is always going to be, because of the uniqueness of being a post-Christian city, being a very progressive city. It's an interesting place to explore how does the gospel actually play itself out in the particular context that we're in. And I'm committed. That's what makes me even more convinced that all the attempts to be about social justice in the past to become relevant at the expense of the gospel has proven to be fatal, actually, for the church here. And what I'd much rather see is gospel-centered witness that then leads to care and concern. We want to preach the gospel in word and in deed, but often deed has been a cover-up for the fact that we don't actually want to talk about the offense of the gospel. And so I think that, talking about Jesus is one thing. Talking about you're a sinful person who needs forgiveness and redemption, and you can't save yourself. And all the things you're pursuing and all the ways you're trying to identify yourself to find meaning in life is not going to be found in anything until you put your trust in Him. And that's where you're going to get the pushback. And so the community has to. I always ask the church, I'm like, we can't make people believe what we believe, but they should at least believe that we believe what we're telling them. Exactly. And they should actually see something in us that they would want. So I'm like, is the church a place where you would want to invite a non-believing friend? And so Dora Pope has really worked hard to create the most beautiful and comfortable space possible to hear the most uncomfortable message possible.
That's good. That's good. It is the most uncomfortable message, but it's good news. That uncomfortable message is really good news. And one of the things that's been struck me a lot just talking to people lately is the word witness. Talk about we're a witness to the Lamb. we're a witness to this suffering servant Jesus. That's I come from a lot of missional theology. I lead a missions organization where we like to talk about all sorts of different things. But this witness thing that's happening in Revelation, it's what Jesus said, "You will be my witnesses," right? And when he ascended back, what is it about being a witness to the foolishness of the cross? How is witness so important?
Yeah, well, I think that's what the world does. Is it's it's a witness to whatever it is it's selling. So, it's like the new priests and priestesses of the modern age are the influencers of our social media. I mean, they're they are witness. They're selling their wares, and they're calling people to worship. Whether it's fitness or health or body positivity or justice issues. There's a million calls, and it's hyper spiritual, and it's very religious. And so for us, it's like our witness is just that. It's like you will talk about, and you will talk about whatever it is you love. And so I put a big emphasis on witness as well, because witness is, and it's a freeing thing.
Yeah.
Like, it's a scary thing. I always call pastors. A lot of pastors don't do altar calls anymore. And that some of them will claim because it's like theological conviction, they don't want to be emotionally manipulative. But I think it's bogus for the most part. I think it's usually I don't want to be humiliated if no one responds. I don't want to be confronted with my own impotence or the lack of power. And I think that what I always tell people is like, you don't save anybody. Like, we're just called, like Jesus said, if I be lifted up, I'll draw people to myself. What we forget is that not everyone who's drawn, everyone may be drawn, but not everyone responds the same. And he draws, but he's also the sword that divides. And like, our responsibility is just to be faithful to lift up and lift up the same message of, I have met Jesus. Come and meet the one. Come and see the one who's revealed everything that makes life make sense. And so that's where I've always encouraged the church from the beginning. It's like, I don't want to be a church that grows by transfer growth. That's not a win. Shifting around the people that are already in the club is, we exist for the good of those outside our walls. Yeah. And, Portland, when I started Door Pope, was a city that the churches were in the city proper, which is what gives Portland its reputation. We're filled primarily with, if it wasn't a fully liberal church that had completely abandoned the gospel, their churches, the only people that were coming were people that don't even live in the city. And so for us early on, it was like, what are the practical ways, simple ways that we can actually be witnesses? Well, part of it was just getting Christians to like come out of the closet. So, when I'd have a young 20-something-year-old barista come, like, I just found out my coworker who I've worked with for 2 years is a Christian, and they're so excited. And I'm like, you shouldn't be excited about that. That's so sad. That you guys have worked really for 2 years and you're just now discovering that you're Christian. That just tells me that you don't think it's appropriate. You think it's a private matter. And I'm like, it's personal, but it's never private. And I'm like, talk about it because you love it. So I would encourage people, bring their Bible and sit in coffee shops, start living out the Christian life naturally. Yeah. The supernatural life should be lived out naturally. Just live it out. Would I tell you in secret, proclaim from the rooftop? And I'm like, it's not going out and yelling at the pagan. I go, you open your Bible in a coffee shop in Portland and sit there and read it, I guarantee people will ask you what you're doing. And so, and that really worked. And then it was just encouraging people like, hey, you don't need to be an evangelist. I'm like, I promise you, if you invite people to church, I promise I will faithfully preach that gospel every week. But you need to be learning and growing so that you can unpack that with them after church. But let's create an invitational come and see model at Door Pope. And it wasn't a secret sensitive model either. It was the idea of, when I prepare sermons for God's people. Yeah. But the gospel has to be informing it and has to be at the center of it. And what I found is that people would come and they're curious. They come for weeks and they would talk about the gospel, and it actually led the community to becoming more evangelistic in the conversations that were happening around it. So, yeah.
That's really good. That's really good. I have a couple questions at the end. One, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Don't do what I did. Don't stay away from hard drugs. Like, and don't believe anything that you believe. If I was to go, Door of Hope's early growth was primarily 18 to 24-year-olds. So the first 5 years, I think I married 75 couples. And I think that was the coolest thing, was to be able, this is why the confessional, I think it's what helped me develop the confessional thing, was I wanted to give people that's what the Bible is. It's like, we don't have the story of David's adultery so that we can feel good about adultery. It's actually, we could actually learn from his mistake and not make that mistake. And so I often would discuss my own stupidity of my early 20s, which was so self-absorbed. And so I think the biggest advice I give people is like, the world, is Chesterton's advice. How much larger would the world be if you were smaller in it? I see a lot of kids with a lot of despair and a lot of anxiety. I have a 21-year-old son, and a 17-year-old daughter, and I've had the joy of, we've always been the house that all their friends have come to, and our thing is rule the home with grace. Like, we can't expect Henry and Hattie to be Christians because their parents are Christians. Like, we have to actually just live out the gospel in a way that and trust that they're gonna have seen something compelling, which is even our brokenness, the quickness of mom and dad to say, hey, we made a mistake, buddy, I got mad, I shouldn't have. Like, never, not pretending like I have all my stuff together, but also pointing them, like, the one thing that you can't get away from is that we have an anchor that has helped us through, trials. And so that's the question I always pose to young people, is like, whatever it is that you're building your life upon. Like me, when I was 21, it's like everything for me was, I discovered as an invisible kid that came up in a broken family and was horribly picked on and bullied through my whole life, to like dancing and singing in, rural America where, sports were reigned supreme. And, when I discovered my singing voice and people cared about it, it was like, all my value, all my hope was in making it in music, because that's where I found meaning, I found acknowledgement. But the forgetfulness is that there's always going to be someone better. Like, the moment your pursuit is to be the best, which was my pursuit, it's like I was setting myself up for ultimate heartbreak, because my foundation was not in anything that was lasting. And so that's why I always encourage people, is like pursue those things. None of those things are bad things. Writing songs, being a musician, being an actor, whatever it is that you do, it's like, get your affections right. So for me, it's like, what's the anchor, the foundation by which you can then, and then I'm like, when Jesus is the anchor in the center, you don't have to take yourself or the world that seriously, but you do have to take him and grace really seriously.
That's good.
So
that's great. Anything that you've been reading, watching, or listening to lately you could recommend?
Yeah. Well, I have the last few years, I went on a major, the two kind of thinkers that I dug deep into and kind of read. I haven't read everything by Jacques Ellul. One of the Ellul was another French philosopher and churchman who wrote a book called The Technological Age, which is probably considered his masterpiece. But there's a book by him that's kind of, he's a very strong believer, part of the French Reformed Church, and definitely a profound thinker, and had unbelievable insight into the impacts of technological advances and the reduction of the human experience into means, into profit, and the reduction of the human experience, and the loss of the sacred, in as we replace it with the secular. He is very helpful, but he wrote a book called Christian Presence in the Modern World, which he wrote in 1948. It's on Whip and Stock. and it is a profound. It's actually the most digestible of his works, and it's kind of his theological grid, and it's so helpful. And his whole thing is that the primary responsibility of the church is to be a witness, and he uses salt and light as the two examples of what the church is to be, and then even the picture of the churches as sheep. And I love. He goes in an age of spiritual dominating. He's like, the church cannot afford to be spiritual dominators. Everybody wants to be the wolf, but we must continue to be the sacrificial sheep. We must point the world to the lamb slain before the foundation of the world by allowing our lives to be poured out for others. And I just found it very challenging, very profound. I love Rene Girard. I just actually finished, I think I've read all of his major works now. And so I just wrapped up with, I Saw Satan Fall Like Lightning, which is a kind of the fruition of his lifelong pursuit of mimetic rivalry, which is really helpful. And then a book that I highly recommend is Carl Trueman's book that came out in 2020. My buddy Tim Mackey, the founder of the Bible Project, who used to be a preacher at Dorbo, said it was one of the most important books he read in the last few years. It's called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And that's out on Zondervan, and it is profound look at from Rousseau all the way to where we're at now with sexual politics and identity and critical theory. And it is a really well written, very thoughtful, and it's not he's British, so it's not like, it doesn't have that like American political edge. It's far more interested in just like, how did philosophy and science and just the modern age bring us to this point. And he doesn't give a lot of answers. He just wants to help you understand where we're at. And so you can be a little discouraged by it, but it's also very helpful to be able to read through something like that without it being vitriolic. And so I really found it very helpful.
That's great. I definitely need to check those out. And so how could people connect with you and find your book, Stumbling Toward Eternity, which is fantastic. And what I love about this book is it goes through the 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross, and we're diving deep into the cross and the foolishness of the cross, that we're contrasting that from ladder theology of trying to work our way up. But also you give little vignettes of your life in the midst of it, and how the cross actually affected your own life and in walking through. And I really loved those. And I thought that it brought it into a place of reality, and to ground it really in the story of you and your father was really, it was beautiful for you to bear your own brokenness in the midst of it as well. And it was really helpful to be able to see that. So I really enjoyed it, and I want people to check it out. How can people find it?
Well, Stumbling Toward Eternity, it is a combination of literary memoir, which is a passion. I love fiction. You're really asking me what I'm reading. I could give you like 10 novels that I would highly recommend. The Passenger by Cormac McCarthy. My favorite. He wrote it 90 years old. The guy is still probably the greatest living author in America, and if not globally. And then there's a new author from Peru, Benjamin Labutat, who wrote a book called When We Cease to Understand the World. And I think it's a profound look at the impact of physics and quantum mechanics. And it's a combination of fiction, nonfiction. So he fictionalizes the interior motivation or thought process behind these great scientists, but explores these powerful questions of like, these guys and their discoveries did not lead them to a belief in nothing. It actually led them to the wall of God himself. And so it's a really profound.
That's cool.
But yeah, Stumbling Toward Eternity it's Penguin imprints, so it's Waterbrook, Multnomah, Multnomah, and you can get it anywhere that sells books, so Amazon, and then I did the audiobook for it as well. And the way that I wrote the book was through I'm a lyrical writer, so I really cared a lot about my prose, and I took a lot of time to write this. It was a very difficult book to write. It's hard to merge memoir and theology without the theology making them being heavy. There's a desire to explain the memoir, and you can't do that. You have to let the narrative be what it is and let the reader experience it for themselves. So I fought my publisher. I'm like, I'm not gonna give lessons out of my life. Like, I just want to share the stories, and hopefully they'll connect emotionally with how these themes from the cross speak to those areas. But I did the audiobook for it, and that I actually, audiobooks have become so popular. A lot of people, have busyness of their lives. And that this book was almost meant to be read out loud because of the way that I write. Because I would write everything out, and then I'd speak it out loud until it sounded like me, except without mistakes.
That's great. Yeah. Well, yeah, go get the audiobook of Stumbling Toward Eternity. And, Josh, this was a fantastic conversation. I just loved going deep into the foolishness of the cross, of what it looks like for us to actually be confronted with the end of ourself, so that we could just have Jesus and say, I'm now dependent totally on you and on the community around us, how confession drives us in community, how we could be a witness to the gospel and to Jesus in everyday life, of saying, this is who I love, and this is what I love, and this is who I am. And so thank you. I really, really enjoyed it. It was a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review, and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes, and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.